I just want to get this thing going. They're very similar questions. And it's not so much a matter of getting around it, but actually, we just had it in this week's Torah portion. So let me just read the story with Shaul, and then we'll then I'll respond to both of your questions, both excellent versions of the same question. Okay, so let's put the Gemara back up. There we are. Okay, now, so let me say like this. So here you have, let me just bring up the piece that shows us this idea about not counting. Let me just bring it up 1 second. Oh boy. Okay. Oh, there we are. Okay. So here it says as follows. So it says that once a man is appointed leader, the community becomes wealthy. I'll go back to that later, derived from the verses, because originally it says he numbered them with bezek, meaning pottery shards, and in the end he numbered them with sheep. Okay, so now before we get that, we're going to go on a whole digression about Shaul. So let me talk about not counting. So we just read in the Torah portion this week, Hitisam, we read it for Shkalim too. So we read it twice in 3 weeks. When you count the children of Israel, you shall count them with a half shekel. So either you give a half shekel or a pottery shard or a sheep. In other words, you give something of yourself. Pottery shards also have use, by the way. The point is you give something of value to the community. That's how we count Jews. Why, and this Lloyd and Joe have a very good question. Why shouldn't we just count people the regular way? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And shall we count with a pasuk or something, yeah? So the answer is that when you count people by number, you are defining all people as of equal value, interchangeable, right? I have a number of people, they're all interchangeable, they're all of the same value, but not just the same value, they're all interchangeable, they're just numbers, right? One of the leading Nazis, Yimach Shemam, said 1 person's a tragedy, 1 million is a number, and, about genocide. And the truth is, though, the danger lies in making people interchangeable. It's like, Lenin said you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, but he wasn't talking about eggs. He was talking about killing people, that we can kill as many people as we need to get a more perfect society for everyone 100 years down the road. So the Torah rebels against this. The Torah tells us you cannot count people as a census. You're going to bring them out to war, you better have a good reason to bring them out to war. And you better make sure you do everything you can to preserve the lives of your soldiers, and so on. People are not interchangeable and are not disposable. When people are interchangeable, they become disposable. It's, your number 362 and your number 363. That's how the Nazis dehumanized Jews, by giving them numbers. So counting someone as a number means you're just an interchangeable, faceless entity that is disposable. So Hashem says, Kitisat, and you're going to have to have armies, and you're going to have censuses, you're going to have to count people. But Kitisat Bnai Israel, when you count the Jewish people, count them with a half shekel. Let each one of them, the same number, the same money, but each one of them give a donation. Everyone's livelihood is different, everyone's circumstance is different. So that half shekel comes from your unique experience of what you do to make a living. And give that half shekel, and that's a donation that is your irreplaceable part in the sacrifices and so on in the temple. So the idea is that we count, and even if it's just a potsherd, we count the people by them giving something of use and value, by them being a dynamic part of something special and unique, because you're giving something, and that part of, and that giving, and that part of whatever communal endeavor is paid for by it is a unique and irreplaceable part. In other words, rather than being passively counted by some power that views you as interchangeable, it's from the bottom up. You are standing up and saying, I am giving this shekel, I am giving this act of tzedakah because I count and I am active and I am dynamic and I'm part of the story. That is why we must not count people as numbers, but so when we use a pasuk to count people, what we're saying is it's not getting around it. We're saying that each one of you is like a verse in a chapter of Tehillim, however you count people, and that's the basic idea. It's a very profound protest in favor of the absolute irreducible value of the individual and their purpose and their deeds.
So in other words, instead of being number 3, you're being a half shekel.
Right, but the half shekel, everyone earns their money differently, and it's an action of your own. In other words, rather than being passively counted, it's like sheep. You're giving something, so you're being counted by your stepping up and being an active part of the community. So you're not a half shekel; you're giving a half shekel.
Okay, and what about a minyan?
The minyan is the same thing. You typically count people with a verse. So Shia Tamecha, because with a verse that has 10 numbers in it, 10 words in it, because you don't want to count people as numbers. Even the not 1, not 2 is an acknowledgement that we don't count people as numbers.
Yeah.
So a minyan is a number, but each person is unique. No two people are exactly the same. As a matter of fact, it has now been discovered that even genetically identical twins have genetical differences, have minor genetic differences. Hashem made every person absolutely unique.
I should say here in Israel, at least once a year, around New Year, they come out with the population figures, and they very clearly state that there are X number of Jews now living here in Israel, and the total population is such and such. Does that somehow violate this?
So I'm sure that with all the religious parties, they worked something out about the way that you do what I'm saying is the way they do the census that avoids this issue. Maybe even filling out a census form, is an act of expressing your individuality, right? You have to fill out a form, and in filling out that form, that expresses who you are and what you're like and so on. The idea is that we shouldn't passively count people as objects. So however you get there, it's the concept. But we know from the Torah that it's okay to list the number at the end, because the Torah 3 times lists the number at the end. And Solomon does a census, and we have the numbers. So it's not wrong listing the numbers as long as the numbers respect the value and individuality and non-interchangeability of each human being.
So, Rabbi, what you're saying, I think what you're saying is the ultimate reason for counting is still the same. We want to know how many people are, for instance, how big can our army be, for instance?
Correct.
How many people are between 20 and 50?
Or how many people can, or how many people can pay taxes. Yeah.
Exactly. But what you're adding is saying, but the counting itself, we are trying to make a statement.
Exactly, precisely. And like I said, maybe filling out the form is that kind of statement.
Okay, but then there's this other side that is trying to say we don't really mean what we're going to be literally as the sand on the beaches, but that we will be a lot. So this, if I had to make sense of it, I would say that Yishmael's future resembles much closer to this blessing that he gives to Avram than Yitzchak.
So first of all, Hashem tells Avram that Yishmael will also be a great nation. Second of all, 1 minute, Hosea is talking about Achrit Hayamim, the end of days. Third of all, remember that the vast majority of Arabs are not descendants of Yishmael. That's the vast majority of Arabs are descended from the other children of Shem, from Ham. Very few Arabs are descendants of Yishmael. There aren't that many descendants of Yishmael, actually. And certainly, there's a whole discussion about this if you want to get factual. But at any rate, the
Okay.
bottom line is that all the promises are for the end of days. So, but meanwhile, meanwhile, if you measure Nobel prizes, so each Jew equals like 100, like 6 million or 7 million other people. Just kidding. Okay, let's go on.
That's a good way to count.
Yeah, well, why not? Okay, so let's go back. Let me go back to the Gemara. Sorry, we lost it. Where did you go? There we are. Okay. Bonk. Okay, so let's continue. So now we're going to talk about, since we're talking about Shaul already, right? That he became wealthy. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good one. Bimadam chata ma beima chata.
Yes, right. So in other words, so now Shaul gets in trouble. Vayorav benachal. So remember, we did the Haftarah recently about how Shaul didn't kill out Amalek. So he, having mentioned the verse about Shaul, the Gemara perceives to serve it more than Pat. And Shaul came to the city of Amalek, and he strove in the valley. At that time, when the time Hashem said to Shaul, go and attack Amalek and destroy everything, he said, if on account of one life the Torah says to bring a heifer whose neck is broken, so I must have pity and take all these Amalekite lives. And if the men have sinned, what of the animals' sins? If the adult have sinned, what way of the children of sins? The divine voice king said, don't be overly righteous. Don't be more merciful than the Creator itself. And later Shaul says, turn down and strike down the priests. A divine voice came forth and said, don't be overly wicked. So the priests of Nob sheltered David and gave him food and a sword when he was running away from Shaul. They didn't know he was running away from Shaul. But Doeg slandered them, and Shaul told Doeg to wipe out the priests of Nob, which he did, which was Shaul's terrible sin. So it's all in the book of Shmuel. So the point is that because Shaul decided he was going to be more righteous than God and not watch out Amalek, he ended up being more wicked as if it were than possible, and wiped out the Kohanim. And this is a very, very difficult piece of Gemara. But it's basically saying that God is usually merciful and very rarely asks us to do very harsh things. But if God asks you to do something, and you know God asked you to do it because the prophet Shmuel said so, do what God says. Because no one is more merciful than God, and you can't second guess God. And because Shaul second guessed God, we had the story where Haman almost wiped out the Jews. And it's the idea that ultimately there are limits to our intellect. And any morality based on intellect will end up doing terrible things. In other words, all the atrocities of fascism and communism are the product of a complex and reasoned intellectual approach. But when you have intellect without God, then you have a lot of tzarot.
You know, Rabbi, this brings up a very difficult and very interesting. After a country does so much damage, such atrocities, like for instance Germany, there were two possible approaches to how to solve it. None of them included executing or killing all the Germans that were left after the war.
But that is exactly right. As I explained when we studied the Haftarah, the only time God gave such a command was about the Canaanites and Amalekites, and only those Canaanites and Amalekites who did not accept the Noahide laws. Any Canaanite or Amalekite who accepts the Noahide laws, who agrees to keep the basic laws of morality and decency, of ethical monotheism, is spared. The Rambam is very clear about this. Maimonides is very clear about this. So the only time God said to wipe out a people is the 7 nations and Amalek at the time when the Jews were first in the land. Now it's established halachically that these nations don't exist as discrete nations, As much as you feel the Germans being spiritually Amalek, there's no proof that they are physically Amalek. The
But
point
I'm
being,
trying.
Joe, let me finish, please.
Okay.
My point is that these commands were unique commands that are beyond the rational. They're not rational. They're not logical. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
They're not
They're not
logical. That's
rational.
true. I agree.
They're
Okay.
not logical, and they're only for that time and place in the time of the first Commonwealth. There is no commandment to wipe out other enemies, not Arabs, not Germans, not no one.
Exactly. Okay.
And my point is, it's a very interesting thing, and I'm going to go on thin ice here. But if you look at the wars that are described in the Quran, many modern Muslims say, oh, we have to act the same way. And when we read the wars described in the Torah, the rabbis jump over backwards to explain why we never should do this again and never will do this again. In other words, wholesale killing is considered an aberration. God commands us, we do it, and God is right and just, and it's a good thing to do, but only when God commands you. Because we see that even with Purim, they didn't wipe out all the Agagites, all their enemies. They only killed the people who fought with them, not their wives, not their children. And that's the derech, that's the path that we follow today. So with regards to Germany, I think, first of all, they had a terrible defeat and millions of them died. And their country was crushed to rubble, and it was demanded of them that they teach the terrible things that they did and learn from it. And it's very fascinating. But today, today, the nation that is most against war, who is very hesitant about war, who came out against the Iraq war, and so on, are the Germans. They've and look, they've taught their children about the Holocaust. Yes, there are neo-Nazis in Germany, but they've tried very hard to learn from their past behavior.
Right. That's exactly. I was going to make a comment.
I mean, I have to say that a nation's character doesn't change overnight. There's still a lot of people with very bad attitudes, but it's different. In the 70s, a lot of the people you were dealing with were actually, they had been Nazis. It's a different generation now. I mean, look, the pain is still there. In my family, in my family, and out of respect to my parents and grandparents, I will not knowingly buy anything made in Germany. That's my thing. It's not a halacha. But I won't. But that's a personal feeling thing. But the fact is that the Torah commanded us to defeat them. The Torah, I have several talks on the laws and articles on the laws of war, that we're not obliged, we're obliged to give people, we're obliged to protect our people. And once, and once people know that there's a war on, it's there, if civilians want to run away, we let them run away. But we're not obliged to render the war effort ineffective because of concerns about collateral damage. And Germany suffered a lot of collateral damage. Today, with modern weapons, Israel, for example, they let people know through their cell phones that they're going to attack a certain area and give them the opportunity to run away. And that's actually halacha brought down in the Gemara, that you should give people who don't want to fight you an opportunity to run away. And and whatever people complain about Israel and its Judaism, the Israeli army the Tzahal, the army, the Air Force, follows this halacha to a T whenever they can. So I'm saying wholesale murder or execution is not something we do. But where Hashem says to do what God tells Shaul, if you will be more merciful than me, which means you second guess me, you will second guess me and massacre our own Kohanim. And we see this. And we see this. The same nation which nation in the 1930s and 40s had the most advanced protection for animals? The best humane laws?
Germany.
And which nation had the least protection for human beings? At the same time, Germany. As Hosea says, beautiful line, Zovchei Adam Agalim Yinshoku. Those who slaughter men kiss cows. So, prophets are called prophets because they predict things that come in the future.
I think since the first and the second world wars were so close to each other, only 20 years apart, I think we learned from the first one, because it didn't work, that gave an excuse of Hitler come to power, and the solution was correct. Both Japan and Germany till this day are really good examples that a country can change and join humankind. Be productive.
But I have to say that the only way murderers, a murderous or violent society is changed when Hashev Gemulo Barosho, when what they did to others is visited upon them. What I mean to say is, when you start a war and utter destruction, annihilation descends upon you, that might teach you that destruction and annihilation are a bad thing. And that is precisely what happened with Japan and Germany. They were so thoroughly destroyed and damaged, and they know it's because of what they started, that they learned their lesson. Sometimes that's the only way. In Ikesh Tishpatol, it says in Tehillim, with those who are crooked, we had this in the Gemara, an extensive, you have to be crooked. But the mitzvah of wiping out Amalek, or the 7 nations, those who don't accept the Noahide laws, is more than that. You should know that the Gemara says that all the nations that occupied Israel were given the opportunity to either accept the Noahide laws and continue living in the land, or leaving, or fighting. He says Yeshua gave them the 3 options. And my point is that annihilation is, the very famous Zionist thinker, Rabbi Chaim Zimmerman. Have you ever heard of him? Zimmerman, his name is in English. Tremendous thinker, one of the most brilliant rabbis, literally, of the last century. A religious Zionist, someone who's actually very close to both Rav Soloveitchik and Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he writes that when you talk about wiping out Amalek or the Canaanites, it's simply God using the Jews as a natural disaster. When there's an earthquake or a tsunami, we mourn it and we feel bad about it, but we just say God did it and we don't know why, because nature is created by God. And by the same token, in this case, God is using the Jewish people as a tsunami for reasons known to himself.
Well,
but what I'm saying is, it's not replicable. That's one of the differences between many, I won't say all, but between many advocates of Islam who see Muhammad's very, very aggressive wiping out of the tribes against him, including some of the Jewish tribes, as being an example. And with the Torah, we all look at these commandments of wiping out Amalek and Canaanites, and it bothers us. And we very clearly interpret to understand it was only at this moment in history and never another time. Because the Torah is its ways are peace, and compassion is its fundamental pillar. Now go ahead, Joe.
I was going to mention, I was 11 when the Second World War ended. In Russia, it celebrated on May 9th, 1945. At the age of 12, a year later, I had a solution to Germany. It's pretty amazing when I think that I was 12 years old. My solution to Germany at the time, and a year later after the war, we already knew what happened, really, literally. And my solution to it was that we should put Berlin really was destroyed. We put a big fence around Berlin, and the rest of Germany be divided among the neighbors like Poland and the northern countries and France and whatever. And and then the German be divided among the rest of the nations, everyone taking 1 million, 500,000,
Yeah,
whatever.
like happened to Poland.
Yeah, and no, in other words, that would be a lesson to everybody. If you do what the Germans did, they'll be the end of you, literally. We didn't do it, and
Well, we
turned out
didn't
to be
we didn't do it because of the Cold War, but you know
many reasons. There are many reasons
but
why
you know
we
what?
didn't do it, and it's
But
fine.
look, Joe, the reality is that the Germans themselves are really, they've become the best witnesses against this sort of thing, you know.
I know,
And
that's what I was saying. So,
but at the same time, the reality is that genocides still happen. And what it's not Germany who hasn't learned their lesson, it's the rest of us, that we don't do anything about this. You know, we keep buying Chinese junk and a lot of things. Like, I can't find a dustpan that isn't made in China, okay? And the Chinese, whatever our issues with some Muslims, they've committed a terrible, terrible genocide and abuse against millions of Muslims in the west of China. And we just, like, there's no consequences. And I should just say that whether it's there or in Sudan and so on, the truth is that the world has an obligation to speak up. We're way over our time, but I'll just share with you one line of the Rambam, and we can talk about it more next time. The Rambam says that what is the job of a Jewish king, and I'm assuming any executive, he's not just Jewish, but he says that a Jewish king, it's his job, l'shaber yad rishei olam, to break the strength of the wicked of the world. Which means to say that if God gives you power and strength, and you see the wicked anywhere in the world doing bad things, you have a certain obligation, if you have that power, to project, to stop it. Okay? We would have wanted the Holocaust to be stopped, but there's a lot of other things that should have been stopped. Afterwards, one of the military, one of the service academies, one of the military schools, I think in Canada, pointed out, the Rwandan genocide, when at least 800,000 people were murdered. Someone pointed out that at the time, 2,000 troops from a Western country could have stopped it. Because that wasn't like Syria. That was a very clear case of one group of people murdering another group of people. And 2,000 troops could have stopped it, and no one lifted a finger. Anyway, that's
the biggest weakness of democracies.
Yeah, but the point is,
they can't do anything till it's too late.
Yossel, ironically, the Germans learned and we haven't. That's the thing. Anyways, I wish everyone a wonderful day. The next Gemara class will be Friday morning. We're not going to have Wednesday and Thursday, and we will have the Parsha class today. It's great to see you all. Have a most wonderful day, and we'll continue with Yoma on Friday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Rav.
Yom Tov. Bye. Bye.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund. Sei gesinnt. Whatever. You see, you cannot part with us.
I'm just looking for the endy thing. There we are. Okay. Bye, everyone. Gotta go do my Rabbeinu Tom's tefillin.